Hey there, welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to be looking at conditional structures. So conditional structures are sentences that typically start with if. So, if I could live anywhere, I would live in Spain. Or, if I could have any superpower, I would have the superpower of becoming invisible. Okay, so conditional structures are very useful for our IELTS writing because they're considered to be complex grammar. So if you use a conditional structure correctly in your essay, you're showing the examiner evidence that you have Band 7 plus grammar. Now, for IELTS writing, we're going to be focusing on the first and the second conditional. However, there are actually other conditional structures that you can use. However, for writing, I think the first and the second conditional are the most useful. So first of all, let's look at the first conditional. Here's some sentences. If universities charge higher prices, fewer people will go. If universities provide grants and scholarships, more young people will be able to enroll. Teenagers will get more stressed if they have too many exams. Teachers will have less time to be creative if they have to constantly prepare their students for the next exam. So these 4 sentences are all taken from model essays and they all use the first conditional. What I'd recommend to you is just to pause the video and try and translate these sentences into your own language. Okay, let's focus on the use. So we use the first conditional when we want to talk about possible situations when the outcome is likely. So if universities charge higher prices, well, that's quite possible. It's not out of this world to imagine that universities will charge higher prices. Or in the second sentence, if universities provide grants and scholarships. Okay, it's also not uncommon that universities provide grants and scholarships. So we use the first conditional when we have possible situations. Okay, how do we form the first conditional? Well, we typically start with if. So we have if and then a clause. So you can see that in sentence number 1 and 2 at the beginning, and in sentence number 3 and 4 in the middle. And that's something important about conditionals, that we can change the order of when the conditional appears. So anyway, we have if, and then we have the present simple. So if universities charge, if universities provide, if they have. So if plus the present simple, and then we have a comma, and then will. So if universities charge higher prices, fewer people will, and then finally the infinitive. So will go, will be able to enroll, will get or will have. So if plus the present simple and then a comma and then will and then the infinitive. Now you'll notice in sentence number 1 and 2 that if the sentence starts with the if clause, so in sentence number 1 and 2, we have a comma. So if universities charge higher prices, comma, fewer people will go. If universities provide grants and scholarships, comma, more people will be able to enroll. So when we start a sentence with a subordinate clause, we have a comma at the end of that subordinate clause. However, in sentence number 3 and 4, we see a different style. In this case, the subordinate clause, the if clause, is at the end. So we don't put a comma. Teenagers will get more stressed if they have too many exams. Okay, so no comma here. However, if we change the order, we could say, if teenagers have too many exams, comma, they will get more stressed. Okay, let's have a look at what other words we can use instead of will. Because one thing you'll notice about conditional sentences is that they don't always use will. Often there are other modal verbs instead. So instead of saying teenagers will get more stressed, we could say something like teenagers might get more stressed, or may get more stressed, or can get more stressed. We could even say teenagers could get more stressed if they have too many exams. Now, we typically use will when we're saying that something is certain. So teenagers will get more stressed. We're saying that is certain. However, if we use something like may, might, can, or could, we're making it sound less probable. We're making it sound less certain. So remember, there are other modal verbs that we can use instead of will. Okay, let's move on now to the second conditional. Sentence number 1. If universities were better funded, they would be able to charge lower rates to students. Okay. Number 2, if university education were compulsory or was compulsory, the level of education would be much higher. Most people would study abroad if it wasn't so expensive. There would be less need for teachers if everyone studied online. Okay, so we use the second conditional when we want to talk about imaginary or unlikely situations. So in sentence number 1, when I say if universities were better funded, I'm suggesting that I think it's unlikely that universities are going to be better funded by the government. Or in sentence number 4, there would be less need for teachers if everyone studied online. I think it's unlikely that everyone will study online, and so I'll use a second conditional here. So often you can choose between using a first and second conditional depending on whether you think something is possible and likely, in which case the first conditional, or unlikely or impossible, in which case you'd use the second conditional. How do we form the second conditional? Well, again, we start with if, but then instead of the present simple, we use the past simple. So if universities were better funded, if university education was compulsory. In sentence number 4, if everyone studied online. Then, instead of using will, we use would. If universities were better funded, they would be able to charge lower rates to students. Okay, and then finally we end with the infinitive again. So if plus past simple, would, and then infinitive. And the same as the first conditional, if we start with the if clause, the subordinate clause, then we need to put in a comma. So we can see that in sentence number 1 and 2. However, if we have the subordinate clause at the end, we don't need a comma, and we can see that in sentence number 3 and 4. Now, you'll notice something about sentence number 2 and 3. We've got 2 different options here. We have was and were. So with singular nouns, or for example it, we can use was or were, and that's because we're talking about a hypothetical situation. Have you ever given anyone advice by saying, if I were you, I would? So you can say if I were you, or if I was you. Both are acceptable. So we can use was or were when we're talking about hypothetical situations like this. Okay, let's move on and let's think about other words that we can use instead of would. So in here we have, if university education was compulsory, the level of education would be much higher. So instead of saying would, let's make something a little less definite. Let's say something like might or could. So in the second conditional, we can use might or could to make something sound less definite, less probable. Now you'll notice we don't use may or can here. We don't typically use may or can in the second conditional, only in the first. Okay, now the last thing that we're going to look at today is some other words that can replace if. Now, there are lots of phrases that can replace if, words like in case or provided. However, I think the most useful substitutes for if are, this is for IELTS writing that is, unless. So unless universities provide scholarships, many people won't be able to afford university fees. Okay, so this is still a conditional structure, but instead of using if, we're using unless. We can also use so long as or as long as. as long as companies are profit-oriented, they will always look for ways to avoid paying tax. So let's look at the use and form. Well, unless means if not. So it's kind of like the opposite of if. It's if not. So people will damage their health unless they stop smoking. So that's the same as saying people will damage their health if they don't stop smoking. Okay. Now, so long as and as long as are the same as if. So we can say things like, if companies are profit-oriented, they will always look for ways to avoid paying tax. And that's the same as saying, as long as companies are profit-oriented, they will look for ways to avoid paying tax. So if means if not, and so long as and as long as are a substitute for if. Okay, we're going to finish with a quiz to test how much you've learnt in this lesson. Question number 1. Which of these sentences uses commas correctly? If university were free for everyone, would more people study? So you can see there are no commas here. In this sentence, there are commas. If university were free for everyone, would more people study? Okay. Now, if we start with the subordinate clause, if we start with the if clause, we need a comma. So the answer is 2. So use a comma when the sentence starts with if. Number 2. Which of these sentences uses commas correctly? You will learn about a new culture if you decide to study abroad. You will learn about a new culture, comma, if you decide to study abroad. Okay, so this time we have the main clause at the beginning and the if clause afterwards, so we don't need a comma. Don't use a comma when the if clause is at the end. Sentence number 3. What word can we put here? If everyone would earn or earned the same salary, the world would be a better place. Okay, so this is the second conditional, and remember we said if plus the past simple. So it's earned. If everyone earned the same salary, so if plus past simple. Number 4. If teenagers have too much homework, they something will have or will to have less time for the activities that they enjoy. Now, remember when we have a modal verb, we don't put to afterwards. So the answer is will have less time for the activities that they enjoy. Don't put to after modal verbs. So modal verbs are the words like will, would, may, might, can, could, must, shall, and we don't put to after these words. Number 5. More people would go to university if it something free. 2 options, were or is. Okay, think carefully. Which conditional is this? Most people would go to university if it were free. So remember, we can use was or were for hypothetical situations. For example, if I was you or if I were you. Of course, I am not you, so it's hypothetical. Number 6, 2 more. Something universities provide scholarships. Many poorer students will not be able to go to university. Unless that or unless. Okay, the answer is unless. We don't use that after unless. So, unless universities provide scholarships, many poorer students will not be able to go to university. Number 7. Companies will continue to avoid taxes, something they are punished, as long as or unless. Okay, now think carefully and try putting the word if in this space. So if the word if fits in the space, then you can use as long as. If the word if doesn't work in this space, then it's probably going to be unless. In this case, it's unless. Remember, so long as is the same as if, or is exactly similar to if, and unless means if not. Okay, finally, the last question, number 8. Something governments continue offering subsidised education, poorer members of society will still be able to receive a decent education, so long as or unless. Again, try putting if into the sentence and then see if it works. In this case, if does work, so we can use the substitute for if, like so long as. Okay. Right, best of luck with your studies, and I hope that conditionals are something that can help you in your IELTS writing, particularly in the linking sentences of your body paragraphs. There's going to be lots of practice of that down below this lesson. Best of luck, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye then.